the machine nobody wanted. By late 1941, the U.S. Navy was desperate for a new torpedo bomber, one that could survive the brutal, high-altitude chaos of modern naval warfare. The previous generation, the TBD Devastator, was already a relic, slow, fragile, and hopelessly outdated. At the Battle of Midway, out of 41 Devastators that attacked, 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit its target. When word of that massacre reached the engineers at Grumman, one man took it personally. His name was Roy Grumman, a meticulous engineer who believed in building aircraft that could take punishment and still bring their crews home. He called his new project the TBF Avenger, and it would become one of the most misunderstood aircraft of the entire war. From the start, the Avenger looked wrong. It was enormous. A massive, barrel-bodied machine that seemed more like a flying bus than a bomber. It could carry a full-size torpedo internally, but the price was complexity. Folding wings, retractable gear, defensive gun turrets, armor plating, and enough internal wiring to confuse even the most experienced mechanics. When Grumman's team rolled the first prototype out in 1941, Navy officials were skeptical. One officer reportedly muttered that it looked like a flying oil drum. Another said flatly, "It'll never get off the deck." But appearances were deceiving. Beneath its clunky frame, the TBF hid a masterpiece of practicality. An aircraft designed not to impress on paper, but to survive the Pacific. The test of fire, Midway's shadow. When the Avenger finally met combat, it was against the most dangerous enemy in the world, the Imperial Japanese Navy. At Midway, 6 brand-new TBFs from Torpedo Squadron 8 launched from Midway Island itself, not from carriers. They flew straight into a swarm of Zeros defending the Japanese fleet. In minutes, 5 of the 6 Avengers were torn apart. Holes punched through their wings, oil pouring from shattered engines, crews fighting fires in the cockpit. Only one limped home. Pilot Ensign Albert Ernest, with his turret gunner dead, his radio man badly wounded, and his controls half shot away. He landed with a crippled aircraft that had taken over 200 bullet holes. The message was clear. The Avenger could take punishment, the Devastator never could. Though Midway was a disaster for the new bomber, it marked something important. The Navy had finally found a torpedo plane that could live long enough to strike back. The Avenger's turning point. Guadalcanal to the Solomons. When the U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August of 1942, they had no idea that the small airfield they captured, Henderson Field, would become one of the deadliest pieces of real estate in the Pacific. The Japanese were determined to take it back. Every day, they launched waves of bombers and fighters from Rabaul. Every night, destroyers crept in under darkness to shell the Marines and land reinforcements. For the Americans on that island, survival depended on what they could keep flying. And that's when the Avenger, big, awkward, and almost unwanted, proved its worth. At first, only a handful of Avengers operated from Henderson. They were patched together with spare parts, often flown by men who had never trained for torpedo runs at sea. But the TBF's design, the same bulky shape that engineers had been criticized for, made it perfect for the punishing tropical climate. Its Wright R2600 radial engine was simple, reliable, and resistant to damage. It could take hits that would tear the nose off a Dauntless or Wildcat. Its long wings gave it the lift to carry depth charges, bombs, or torpedoes, even with fuel tanks full and the humidity thick as syrup. And when the Japanese came at night, dropping flares and bombs over Henderson, the Avenger's turret gun, manned by some of the youngest gunners in the Navy, spat back streams of .50 caliber tracer, glowing red across the jungle sky. Soon, word spread among the pilots. The TBF might be ugly, but it was tough. It could go the distance, and it could come home when nothing else did. In the Solomons, Avengers became the workhorses of every carrier and island base. They hunted submarines, struck convoys, and flew night raids where no other American aircraft dared to go. One squadron commander called it a ship that could take a licking and still come back for dinner. By late 1942, the Avenger had gone from an experiment to a legend in the making. The heart of the beast, Grumman's Iron Works. To understand why the Avenger was so durable, you have to understand the place it came from. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, based in Bethpage, Long Island, wasn't a typical manufacturer. It was a family, and its factory was nicknamed the Iron Works. The name wasn't a joke. Grumman's engineers were famous for overbuilding everything. They refused to cut corners, and they didn't care if their planes looked heavy, as long as they got their pilots home. Inside the Iron Works, every employee knew they were building something that might be the difference between life and death for a 20-year-old kid over the Pacific. One worker later recalled, "We used to say if you could get an Avenger airborne, you could probably fly it through a brick wall." Every part of the TBF reflected that mentality. The self-sealing fuel tanks could stop bullets and still keep the engine running. The hydraulic folding wings made carrier storage possible without compromising strength. And the ball turret, designed for 360-degree defense, meant that enemy fighters could no longer pick off torpedo bombers from behind with impunity. When Grumman couldn't produce enough Avengers to meet demand, General Motors was brought in, building a nearly identical version called the TBM. Together, they would roll out more than 9,800 aircraft, enough to equip every major U.S. carrier and most of its island-based squadrons. Each one, in a sense, was a flying fortress built for the sea. The battle that changed everything. Midway's revenge. By mid-1943, the United States was no longer fighting for survival. It was fighting for momentum. The turning point had come with the twin offensives across the Central and South Pacific. A relentless series of landings and carrier strikes that would push the Japanese Empire back toward its homeland. At the heart of those operations was a new kind of warfare. The Carrier Task Force, a floating city of power, coordination, and precision. And leading the assault waves were the Avengers. Unlike the lumbering torpedo planes of 1942, the Avengers of 1943 were part of a well-oiled machine. Each strike group combined fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers in a single, synchronized wave. The Avengers didn't charge suicidally into anti-aircraft fire anymore. They struck from multiple directions using radar coordination and timed approach vectors. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, for example, what pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Avengers attacked in perfect concert with Hellcats and Dauntless dive bombers. Their torpedoes were new, reliable, and deadly, no longer plagued by the duds and premature explosions that had cursed the Navy 2 years earlier. In one attack against the carrier Hyo, Avengers dropped from cloud cover at just 200 feet above the sea. They weaved through walls of flak, released their Mark 13 torpedoes, and pulled up hard, watching as 2 detonations ripped through the Japanese ship's hull. Within an hour, the Hyo was gone, taking over 250 of her crew with her. The Avengers had avenged Midway. But the true secret of their success wasn't the weapon they carried. It was the team that flew them. Pilots and crews had become brothers, literally fighting as three-man families in the sky. The pilot, the radio man, and the turret gunner trusted each other completely. They flew missions in storms, at night, through enemy fire, and often beyond their fuel limits. One pilot wrote home that he could feel the gunner behind him breathe through the armor plate. That bond became a signature of the Avenger. And it showed in the precision of their strikes, the discipline of their approach, and the quiet courage it took to fly straight into a wall of explosions, the rise of the torpedo plane, and the fall of the fleet carrier. As 1944 unfolded, the Avengers became more than just torpedo planes. They became scouts, anti-submarine hunters, and even pathfinders for new weapons. The same aircraft that once limped home full of bullet holes was now guiding radar-directed night strikes across entire archipelagos. Their search radars could pick out ships hidden in storm clouds. Their sonar buoys could detect submarines running silent beneath the waves. By the end of the year, the Avenger wasn't just part of the Navy's doctrine. It was defining it. When Admiral Mark Mitscher led the fast carrier task force against the Japanese home islands, Avengers spearheaded the offensive. They flew hundreds of missions from carriers like the Essex, Bunker Hill, and Enterprise, hitting convoys, refineries, and shipyards with precision that had been unthinkable just a year earlier. But their power came with a price. As Japanese resistance grew more desperate, kamikaze attacks became a daily terror. Avenger crews often returned to find the deck littered with burning wreckage, flight crews diving into flames to pull out trapped pilots, explosions echoing across the sea. Yet the sorties continued, hour after hour, day after day. For the first time, air superiority wasn't just about who had the fastest plane. It was about who could endure, who could coordinate, adapt, and strike without faltering. And in that sense, the Avenger had become the perfect symbol of the American way of war. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't elegant, but it was relentless. The men who made the Avenger immortal. Every machine, no matter how well built, is only as good as the men who fly it. And the Avenger was no exception. By late 1944, thousands of young pilots were learning to master this heavy, three-man torpedo bomber. A plane that could make or break them on their first carrier landing. Many were barely 20 years old. Some had never seen the ocean until the day they sailed into war. One of them was a tall, quiet 20-year-old from Connecticut named George Herbert Walker Bush. In September 1944, Bush flew his TBF Avenger from the carrier USS San Jacinto during a mission over the Japanese-held island of Chichijima. The target, a radio tower used to coordinate enemy attacks against American forces. Bush and his crew dove through thick anti-aircraft fire. Shells bursting so close that fragments punched through the fuselage. Moments after releasing his bombs, his Avenger was hit. Flames tore across the fuselage, filling the cockpit with smoke. He gave the order to bail out. His two crewmates, radio man John Delaney and gunner William White, never made it out. Bush parachuted into the sea, drifted for hours on a small raft, and was eventually rescued by a U.S. submarine. He would later become the youngest naval aviator to survive being shot down in World War II. That mission, tragic, courageous, and haunting, symbolized everything about the Avenger's legacy. It was never the fastest aircraft, never the most glamorous. But it was flown by men who believed in something bigger than themselves. Every Avenger crew shared that unspoken bond. a quiet understanding that their odds weren't always good, but their mission mattered. And that bond held even when the sky turned to fire. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Avengers launched into the teeth of Japan's final naval offensive. They faced waves of enemy ships, kamikazes, and flak so dense that pilots described it as flying through black rain. Yet they went anyway. One squadron from USS Essex lost half its aircraft in a single day, but managed to cripple multiple Japanese ships, including the carrier Zuikaku, which had helped plan Pearl Harbor. It was poetic justice and brutal redemption. By war's end, Avengers had sunk over 30 enemy submarines, crippled or destroyed dozens of warships, and flown nearly 46,000 combat missions. Their crews received hundreds of Navy crosses and distinguished flying crosses, not for the machines they flew, but for the courage they embodied. The kamikaze storm and the Avengers' final trial. As Japan's empire collapsed in 1945, a new nightmare emerged over the Pacific, the kamikaze. To the men aboard the carriers, the word meant one thing: death from the sky. They watched as Japanese pilots, many barely trained, some only 17, deliberately turned their planes into living bombs. For the first time, the enemy wasn't trying to win the air war. They were trying to die honorably in defeat. The Avengers, with their heavy armor and long range, were among the few planes that could intercept kamikazes before they reached the fleet. They flew patrols in pairs, circling far ahead of the carriers, scanning the horizon for faint glimmers of sunlight on metal. When they found the enemy, they dove without hesitation, trading altitude for speed, firing until their guns overheated. Some never returned. On April 6, 1945, the opening of the Battle of Okinawa, over 350 kamikazes swarmed the Allied fleet. Avenger squadrons from carriers like Bunker Hill, Essex, and Enterprise fought relentlessly, shooting down dozens but losing many of their own. The sky that day was filled with smoke, tracer fire, and falling debris, a chaotic ballet of courage and madness. By nightfall, the Avengers had saved ships, lives, and perhaps the invasion itself. But the cost was written in names. The names of gunners, radiomen, and pilots who never made it back to the deck. Even the aircraft itself seemed to bear the scars of exhaustion. Bullet holes patched with tape, engines rattling from months of nonstop flight. Yet they kept flying. Because that's what the Avenger did best. It endured. The last mission. The end of the Empire. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard of ships, planes, and ambition. Japan's once mighty navy was gone, its air force shattered, its cities burning under waves of American bombers. But still, the fighting continued. From the decks of carriers like USS Bunker Hill and USS Yorktown, Avengers flew their final missions, strikes against the home islands, anti-shipping patrols, and desperate searches for survivors among the waves. They bombed factories, harbors, and airfields. And they hunted what remained of Japan's submarines, knowing each one could still kill hundreds of sailors if left unchecked. For the men in the air, the feeling was strange. Victory was certain, but it didn't feel like triumph. The sky was quieter now, the resistance scattered. But each flight carried an undertone of sadness, a recognition that the era of the great piston-engine warriors was ending. When word reached the fleet on August 15, 1945, that Japan had surrendered, the reaction was unlike anything before. Cheers, tears, and silence all at once. For some, It meant going home. For others, it meant remembering those who never would. The Avengers flew one last time. Not in anger, but in peace. They dropped food and supplies to prisoners of war. They mapped the devastated cities below, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo, all reduced to ash and steel. And as they flew over a defeated Japan, their engines echoed a final eulogy for an age of courage, invention, and unimaginable loss. The legacy of the Avenger. A machine built to endure. When the war ended, the Avenger refused to fade away. It went on to serve for decades in Korea, in the Atlantic, and across the world's oceans as a search and rescue and anti-submarine aircraft. The Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and even civilian air services flew them well into the 1960s. In a time of jets and missiles, the old Grumman workhorse still found purpose. But for those who knew it best, the pilots, mechanics, and gunners, it would always be more than an aircraft. It was a home in the sky, a steel guardian, and a reminder that survival, not speed, wins wars. One veteran described it simply. It wasn't beautiful, but it brought me back. And that's all the beauty I ever needed. Today, a handful of Avengers still fly, restored, gleaming in sunlight, their engines roaring with the same deep growl that once echoed across the Pacific. At air shows, they draw the gaze of children who see only a machine. But to those who understand, to those who remember, they represent something far greater. They are the sound of history, of courage forged in metal, and of men who flew into hell and came home through sheer will. The Avengers story isn't just about war. It's about what happens when ordinary men are asked to do the impossible and find a way to do it anyway. It's the story of endurance, of sacrifice, and of victory at a terrible cost. And when that deep, rumbling engine fades into silence, it leaves behind not emptiness, but a legacy that refuses to die. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.